The folder was already on the table when I walked into Maple Room. Cream paper. My name on the tab. A bottle of water sweating onto a coaster nobody had bothered to center. The vent above the door was pushing cold air hard enough that I felt it on my hands before I sat down. Melissa Crane from HR looked at me and said, "Dana, today will be your last day with Redstone." I looked at the date on the cover sheet. September 11th. My pension vested on October 4th. 23 days. My name is Dana Mercer. I was 49 years old when they decided I had become too expensive to keep, which was interesting because for 19 years I had been the person saving Redstone Driveline Systems from the cost of its own bad decisions. Redstone made axle housings and steering assemblies for municipal trucks and agricultural equipment out of a plant just outside Dayton, Ohio. Not glamorous work. Important work. The kind of work that keeps snowplows moving in January and utility fleets running in July. I started there at 30 as a production supervisor on second shift. By 49, I was plant manager. 19 years. Same facility. Same concrete floors, same smell of coolant and steel dust at 6:30 in the morning, same break room coffee that always tasted faintly of burned hazelnut no matter what label was on the bag. I built the shift loss escalation grid in 2016, which cut unplanned downtime by 28% in its first year because problems stopped disappearing between shifts. I built the Blue Tag Recovery Protocol in 2018, which reduced shipping defects by 41% and prevented about $230,000 a month in returns, credits, and expedited freight. I renegotiated our outside maintenance contracts in 2021 and saved Redstone $1.8 million over 3 years without cutting a single technician. And in 2022, I rebuilt our line balancing schedule after the Farmark program expansion, which lifted on-time delivery from 82% to 98.6% in 2 quarters. None of that was magic. It was attention. It was notes. It was walking the floor enough years to know which press was lying to you when it sounded fine, and which supervisor was lying to you when he said a miss happened all at once. I slept on a cot in my office during the February ice storm in 2021 because if the boiler loop froze, we would lose the heat treat line for 10 days and wipe out a $2.4 million customer schedule. I missed my 20th anniversary dinner because a gearbox failure on line 6 hit at 5:12 p.m. and the city fleet order behind it had liquidated damages attached. My husband ate salmon alone that night and texted me a picture of the empty chair across from him with the message, "I assume Redstone is paying for dessert." That was the thing about being useful in a plant. The work gets intimate. The place gets into your bones. Which is why men like Brent Talbot always mistake competence for furniture. They think if something has been there a long time and works quietly, it must be simple to replace. Brent was 34 years old, 6 months into his role as Vice President of Operations, and exactly 1 son away from never being hired into that job. His father, Patrick Talbot, was Redstone's CEO. That was the qualification. Brent came in from strategic operations, which in his case meant 14 months at corporate and a resume full of words like transformation, synergy, and optimization arranged in a confident order. On his first walk through the plant, he wore brand new steel toe boots with the sticker still on the sole and safety glasses pushed up in his hair like sunglasses. He called the machining cells verticals and asked me if our just-in-time labor model could absorb a 12% headcount reduction. I said, "We don't have a just-in-time labor model. We have people." He smiled like I'd missed a joke. At his second staff meeting, he clicked through a slide deck I had seen pieces of before because 3 of the ideas on it were mine. He called my line balancing redesign a Brent-led throughput modernization initiative. Ray Gutierrez, my maintenance superintendent, sat 2 seats down from me and wrote 1 sentence on his yellow pad in block letters. He is wearing loafers to a foundry. He tore it off and slid it to me under the table. I kept my face neutral. It was one of my better skills. Brent liked to use manufacturing language the way tourists use a phrasebook. Not well. Not for long. And always with confidence. He said things like, "We need to leverage more OEE discipline at the floor interface," pronouncing OE like it was a highway. He called a lockout tagout review, that lockstep safety thing. He once asked if scrap could be deferred to next quarter, which told me he viewed metal the way a bad office manager views printer paper. At a production review in June, he pointed to our overtime line and said, "This legacy labor profile is exactly why we need fresh operating energy." I said, "Overtime is up because the city transit contract moved forward by 6 weeks." He said, "Right? That's the symptom. I'm talking about the disease." Ray, sitting beside me, said very softly, "Disease now." "Good. We're doing medicine." Brent ignored him. Melissa Crane was worse in a quieter way. She was 41, director of HR, and had spent most of her career at a hospitality management company before coming to Redstone. She dressed beautifully for offices with carpet and filtered water. In a plant, on epoxy floors, in heels she could barely cross the production corridor in, she looked like she had been dropped into the wrong movie. Melissa liked phrases such as people architecture and leadership right-sizing. She also liked spreadsheets. In late July, Denise Holloway from payroll stopped by my office holding one of those spreadsheets and closed my door behind her. Denise had been at Redstone 12 years. She spoke carefully, but not by accident. She spoke carefully because she listened first. She said, "Dana, I'm asking this as your friend, not payroll." I looked up from the shift reports. "That's usually the sentence people say right before payroll becomes very relevant," I said. She gave me a tight smile. "Melissa asked for a service date report," she said. "Everybody over 15 years. She wanted pension eligibility dates on the same sheet." I set my pen down. "When?" "This morning." "What reason did she give?" Denise hesitated. "Workforce planning." I leaned back in my chair. "Workforce planning," I repeated. "Yeah." I asked, "Who else was on the list?" Denise named 4 people. 2 supervisors nearing early retirement eligibility. 1 quality manager with 17 years. "Me," I said. "Did she ask for current salary too?" Denise looked at me for a second. "Yes. There are moments in corporate life when something small slides half an inch out of alignment, and if you've been around long enough, you feel it immediately. That was one of them." I said, "Send me my latest pension statement to my house." "Not through interoffice." Denise nodded once. "You think they're going to try something?" I said, "I think Melissa doesn't ask for a report like that because she's bored." The next month confirmed it. Brent started talking about flattening plant leadership. He wanted more dynamic floor ownership and less legacy overhead between the decision and the action, which was his way of saying he wanted to remove experienced managers and spread their responsibilities across people who did not have the authority, background, or salary to argue with him. At an August operating review, he pointed to the plant org chart and tapped my box with a pen. "This role," he said, "is built for an older model." I said, "The role runs a 312-person manufacturing operation supplying 6 contracted programs with liquidated damages." He said, "Exactly. Too centralized." Ray said, "You say centralized like the presses are going to start managing themselves." Brent gave him the look men like Brent give when someone with grease under his nails speaks in a meeting they assumed they controlled. He said, "What I'm hearing is resistance." I said, "What you're hearing is experience." That meeting ended early. Melissa asked me to stay after. When Ray and the others left, she closed the door and smiled the way HR people smile when they want a conversation to sound casual and documented at the same time. She said, "Dana, just so I understand your medium-term plans, have you been thinking about retirement timing at all?" There it was. Neat. Polite. Stupid. I said, "Why?" She said, "No reason. We like to support our long-tenured leaders in planning for life transitions." I said, "I'm planning to come to work tomorrow." Her smile held for 1 second too long. That night I pulled every pension statement I had received in the last 5 years and spread them across my dining room table. Vesting schedule. Years of credited service. Plan summary. Beneficiary forms. Annual HR memos. Then I added my pay stubs, performance reviews, bonus letters, and the service date confirmation Denise had quietly mailed to my house 2 days earlier. 19 years of service would become full pension vesting on October 4th. 23 days after the date that was now on the severance packet sitting in Maple Room. I called an attorney the next morning. Her name was Rebecca Sloan. Employment law, Columbus office, sharp voice, no wasted words. Denise's cousin had used her in a wage case 3 years earlier and described her as pleasant until paperwork starts, then frightening. That sounded useful. Rebecca asked 3 questions before she said anything else. When does the pension fully vest? October 4th. When do you think they may terminate you? Soon. Do you have documentation showing they're reviewing service dates and pension status? Yes. She said, good. Keep everything. Then she explained something Melissa Crane should have read before deciding she was qualified to manage other people's futures. Ohio had a state anti-forfeiture protection tied to employer action within 90 days of pension vesting. If an employer terminated an employee to prevent or interfere with vesting, the timing itself became evidence. If the documentation was as clean as I thought it was, they would not just owe the pension. They could owe back pay, attorney's fees, and whatever else a court found appropriate once intent entered the room. Rebecca said, if they fire you inside that 90-day window, do not sign anything at the table. I said I wasn't planning to. She said, good. People who skim severance agreements tend to lose rights. People who skim state law tend to lose money. I liked her immediately. So by the time I walked into Maple Room on September 11th, I was not surprised. Angry, yes. Surprised, no. Brent was already seated when I came in, jacket off, sleeves rolled in the way insecure executives think makes them look operational. Melissa had the folder in front of her. Nobody had brought legal, which told me one of 2 things. Either legal had approved this without understanding the facts, or Melissa had decided legal was an obstacle to momentum. I had a pretty good idea which one it was. Melissa folded her hands. Dana, as part of a broader restructuring of plant leadership, we're eliminating the plant manager role effective today. Brent added, we're moving to a more agile floor-led model. Of course they were. I asked, who reports to whom under this model? Brent blinked. We're still socializing the final org, which meant they had fired the plant manager before deciding who would run the plant. I looked at the folder. 7 pages. 8 weeks of severance. Standard release language. Return of company property. Non-disparagement. And on page 6, exactly where I expected it, a pension summary showing my currently vested amount, not the fully vested amount due 23 days later. Melissa slid a pen toward me. If you sign by Friday, payroll can process severance without delay. I looked at her. Have you reviewed my vesting date? I asked. She said, your current benefits are outlined in the packet. Not what I asked. Brent leaned forward. This is a generous package, Dana, especially given the timing. There are some sentences you remember because they were brilliant, and some because they were catastrophically unwise. That one belonged in the second category. The room was too cold. I could hear the vending machine compressor in the hallway clicking on and off. Melissa's nails tapped once against the folder, then stopped when she realized I was noticing. I said, I'll have my attorney review it. Melissa's face changed by half an inch. Dana, this is a standard separation agreement. I stood up. I'm sure it is. Brent said, I'd prefer to keep this collaborative. I picked up my bag. You should have started there, I said. Then I walked out. I did not stop at my office. I did not make a scene. I passed the front admin area, where 2 supervisors suddenly became very interested in a whiteboard schedule they had clearly not cared about 30 seconds earlier. Ray was coming down the corridor from maintenance, saw my face, saw the folder in my hand, and slowed. He said, quietly, they did it. I said, yes. His jaw tightened. He looked toward Maple Room, then back at me. Need anything? I said, not from them. He nodded once. That was enough. I walked through the lobby, out into the September heat, and sat in my truck for exactly 3 minutes before calling Rebecca Sloan. She answered on the second ring. They fired you, she said. Yes. What's the effective date? Today. How far from vesting? 23 days. She let out one short breath. Good, she said. I smiled despite myself. Most people don't use that word there. I do, she said. Did you sign anything? No. Excellent. Email me the packet, your latest statements, the service date report, and anything showing they were reviewing pension timing. I'll draft a preservation notice this afternoon. I said, You think Melissa read the law? Rebecca said. Dana, based on experience? I think Melissa read the first page of a memo someone else summarized. That was what they didn't know. Not that I had a secret account. Not that I had hidden some magic switch only I could flip. Plants are not movies. Manufacturing problems do not resolve themselves around dramatic reveals. What they didn't know was simpler and much more dangerous. I had records. I had dates. I had 19 years of performance history with no disciplinary actions, no performance plan, no business decline, and no legitimate reason to eliminate the role of the person running a facility that was currently hitting 98% on-time delivery. I had the payroll report request. I had the pension statements. I had the org chart Brent kept marking up with phrases like leaner leadership layer and legacy cost compression. I had Melissa's life transitions conversation written down in a notebook with the date, time, and exact wording. And because I had spent 19 years actually running the place, I also knew what the next 2 weeks inside that building were going to look like without me. The Blue Tag Recovery Protocol required plant manager approval for any shipment deviation to municipal customers. The weekend maintenance ladder routed critical vendor escalation through my authorization code because finance had refused to give that authority to supervisors after a very expensive mistake in 2019. The Farmark account review happened every Thursday at 4 p.m., and I was the one who knew which late orders could be split, which could not, and which customer would accept a partial truck if you called the right person before 3. All of that was documented. Not badly. Not carelessly. Documented the way I document everything. But documentation does not create judgment. It only preserves the path for people who already have it. Rebecca sent the preservation notice at 3:42 that afternoon. She copied outside counsel, corporate HR, and the general counsel's office. She also informed them that any effort to condition severance on a release of pension-related claims would be viewed accordingly, which was a lawyer's way of saying, I know what you're doing and I would advise you to stop doing it in writing. I went home, changed clothes, and made pasta. At 6:18 p.m., my phone lit up with Brent Talbot's name. I watched it ring, then stop, then ring again. I answered on the second call. Dana, he said, too quickly, I just wanted to do a quick alignment pass on some transition items. Transition items, I said. Yeah, a few operational knowledge points. Nothing major. I took a sip of water. Brent, if it's nothing major, I'm sure you'll manage. He gave a strained little laugh. Well, some of the accountabilities are more embedded than we expected. Of course they were. I said, that sounds like a planning issue. Dana, this doesn't need to become adversarial. It became adversarial in Maple Room. He was quiet. Then he said, can you just help us locate the vendor override path for the heat treat backup? There it was. Less than 6 hours. I said no. And hung up. 48 hours later, the first thing broke. It was Saturday morning. Ray called at 7:06. He never called that early unless something metal and expensive had stopped moving. I answered and said, what happened? He said, line 4 furnace tripped at 5:40. Main control board fault. We can repair it, but not before Monday night. I sat up straighter. Line 4 handled the high-volume municipal axle run. What's loaded? Dayton Fleet, Columbus Sanitation, and half the Farmark emergency batch. I did the math in my head. That's an $810,000 weekend if it misses. Yeah. I asked, did Brent authorize the backup vendor transfer? Ray gave a short, humorless laugh. He asked me if we could just move the steel to line 2. Like heat treat is a spare conference room. I said nothing. Ray said, the backup vendor won't touch the order without the plant manager approval code, and Melissa won't authorize anything because she says separation status may create liability. I closed my eyes for 1 second. There is a special kind of damage that happens when the wrong confident person meets the wrong careful person and decides careful is optional. This was that. Ray said, I'm not asking you to do anything. I just thought you should know. I know, I said. He lowered his voice. Everything's getting weird in here. How weird? Brent keeps saying we need a workaround mindset. Maintenance wants a PO. Purchasing wants the approval chain. No one knows who's allowed to sign what. He's been on speaker with 3 people from corporate for an hour and keeps using the word agile like it opens purchase orders. I let that sit for a second. Then I said, document everything. Ray snorted. Been taking notes since Tuesday. Good. At 8:31, Brent called. I did not answer. At 8:34, he texted, need immediate support on critical customer continuity issue. At 8:36, this is bigger than emotion. At 8:41, call me back. We're trying to avoid a major client event. I put the phone down and went outside to water the tomatoes my husband had already watered. It seemed worth doing twice. At 9:12, Denise called. Her voice was tight. Dana, are you home? Yes. Okay. I need to tell you something before somebody else does it badly. I leaned against the kitchen counter. Tell me. Rebecca Sloan's letter hit corporate yesterday afternoon. Melissa didn't know about the 90-day protection. There are moments when vindication arrives so early it almost feels impolite. I kept my voice level. I assumed she didn't. Denise said, no, Dana, I mean she really didn't know. She called payroll this morning asking for your payout coding, and when I told her legal had frozen it pending review, she said, review of what? I said nothing. Denise continued, corporate counsel asked for every report Melissa pulled on service dates, pension eligibility, and salary. Every one. From July forward. And Melissa's in Cedar Room with legal right now. Brent went in 10 minutes later. He's been in there ever since. I asked, did anyone mention the furnace? Denise let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. The furnace is somehow not the biggest problem anymore. That was fast. Too fast for them. Right on time for me. At 11:03, Brent called again. This time I answered. His voice had changed. The swagger was still trying to stand up, but something heavier had sat on it. Dana, we need to talk. You've said that. This situation is becoming unnecessarily complicated. I looked out the window at my backyard. No, I said. It was always complicated. You just noticed late. He exhaled sharply. We're trying to resolve this professionally. You fired me 23 days before full vesting. Silence. Then, that decision was based on restructuring needs. Then your documentation should support that. He did not answer. I said, good luck with line 4. And ended the call. The second problem hit before they solved the first. At 4:17 that afternoon, Rebecca called. She said, I have their response. I sat down. Already? Yes. And Dana. Her voice had that pleased, dangerous edge I had started to enjoy. What? I asked. She said, I think your HR director just made a very expensive mistake in writing. I did not speak. Rebecca continued. Melissa responded before outside counsel cleaned it up. She acknowledged they reviewed your vesting timeline as part of cost containment planning and said the separation package was designed to address your remaining weeks of exposure. There are bad sentences. Then there are sentences that buy somebody else's retirement. I said, very quietly, she wrote that. She did. I looked at the clock on the stove. For 19 p.m. Somewhere in Dayton, Brent Talbot still had a dead furnace, an $810,000 shipment problem, a plant he did not know how to run, and an HR director who had just handed my attorney intent in a complete sentence. Rebecca said, don't respond to anyone this weekend. Let them sit with it. I said, what happens Monday? She paused. Then she said, Monday, Dana, they learn what 23 days can cost. And that was when I knew the real panic at Redstone had not even started yet. By the end of the second week, Redstone had managed to turn one bad decision into 4 different kinds of damage. The technical problem was still sitting on line 4. The relational problem had spread to customers. The financial problem had reached corporate. And the legal problem was now being printed on letterhead. The furnace failure that started on Saturday rolled into Monday morning without a clean workaround. Brent had spent most of the weekend trying to socialize a temporary decision framework, which was a very polished way of saying he had no authority map, no approval path, and no idea which signatures actually mattered. Line 4 stayed down. The backup heat treat vendor stayed idle. The Dayton fleet order missed its truck. So did Columbus Sanitation. And Farmark, which tolerated exactly one thing in a supplier relationship, predictability, got half a load and a promise. Promises are very expensive in manufacturing, especially when they replace steel. Ray called me Monday night from the parking lot. He said, "You want the clean version or the real version?" "The real version." Brent put Farmark on speaker with corporate this afternoon. I leaned back in my chair. "That sounds unwise." "It got better," Ray said. He told them the delay came from a legacy authorization bottleneck left behind by prior leadership. I said nothing for a second. Then, he blamed me on a client call. "Not just a client call," Ray said. Patrick was on it. Purchasing, finance, 2 people from corporate legal, and the Farmark account team. There are mistakes. And then there are statements made in front of lawyers and customers at the same time. Those have a different weight. I asked, how did Farmark take it? Ray let out one short breath. Their operations director asked who removed the plant manager before replacing the approval chain. I closed my eyes for exactly 1 second. And Brent said the structure change was part of a broader efficiency model. I said, of course he did. Ray continued, then Farmark asked whether Redstone had fired the only person authorized to release emergency vendor capacity during an open production interruption. I stood up and walked to the kitchen window. What did Patrick say? Nothing. Which was worse. That was the public mistake. Not because Brent said something rude. He wasn't clever enough for rude. He simply said the true part out loud in the wrong room. He admitted, in front of a major customer and half of corporate leadership, that Redstone had eliminated the plant manager role before anyone understood what the role actually controlled. By Tuesday morning, Farmark suspended the next 2 scheduled releases on the AG equipment program until Redstone provided a written continuity plan and a stable leadership structure. That contract was worth $6.4 million annually. Not lost yet. Just standing at the door with its coat on. The financial damage followed right behind it. Redstone paid expedited freight on the municipal orders, absorbed contract penalties on the Columbus sanitation run, and lost the early payment discount on 2 steel shipments because accounts payable had frozen a batch of approvals during the legal review. Finance, which rarely notices plant decisions until they show up in 6 figures, noticed this one quickly. By Wednesday, Denise told me corporate had set aside a litigation reserve before October had even started. That is not a thing companies do when they believe everything is fine. She called at lunch, voice low. "Dana, Melissa's gone." I put my fork down. "Gone how?" "Badge shut off at 10:15. Box in hand by 10:30. No announcement." There it was. Quiet. Corporate likes quiet when it has to admit something embarrassing happened in HR. I asked, what about Brent? Denise gave a short laugh. Still here. But now everybody watches him the way people watch a man carrying a gas can near a bonfire. That sounded right. She continued, corporate counsel pulled every separation packet from the last 18 months. Everyone Melissa touched. Payroll is reviewing pension coding on all of them. I said, so this is no longer just about me. No, Denise said. Now it's about whether she did this before and nobody noticed. That was the regulatory problem growing legs. Rebecca had filed the same week, exactly as promised. Demand letter first. Preservation notice already out. Then the formal complaint draft, ready if Redstone wanted to keep pretending my vesting date was a coincidence. They stopped pretending on Wednesday. Rebecca called me at 4:40. She said they want to discuss settlement. That was quick. Melissa's email helped. I smiled slightly. I assumed it might. Rebecca said, also, Brent's client call helped. I walked back to the table. Farmark. Yes. They documented the continuity concern in writing. Once customers start memorializing leadership failures, companies become much more interested in resolution. I asked, what are they offering? She paused. Initial proposal. Full pension vesting, 12 weeks back pay, attorney's fees, and a consulting arrangement if you're willing to assist through the operational transition. I let that sit in the air. Consulting. Yes. Through the operational transition created by the people who fired me. Yes. I said no. Rebecca was quiet for half a beat. Do you want me to soften that? No, I said. Tell them I don't consult for people who are still calling this a restructuring. She laughed once. A good laugh. Efficient. Expensive. I'll pass that along exactly. That should have been enough for them. It was not. Because by Thursday, the second wave had turned into a plant-wide credibility problem. Brent held an all-hands leadership meeting in Cedar Room with supervisors, maintenance leads, scheduling, payroll, and customer service. I know because Ray called me from his truck afterward and said, if you were here, you'd have enjoyed the ending. Tell me. Ray said. Brent tried to explain the delays using a slide called Organizational Agility Response Matrix. I said, that sounds fake. It was very fake, Ray said. Then someone from customer service asked who had final say on deviation shipments now. And? He said accountability had been distributed horizontally. I leaned against the counter. Ray continued, then Denise, God bless her, asked if distributed horizontally means payroll, purchasing, maintenance, and shipping can all approve liability on public contracts. I smiled. What did he say? He said, at this point we're empowering decisions at the edge. I said, he really says these things out loud. He does, Ray said. And then Patrick, who had come in from corporate and was standing in the back, said, Brent, answer the question. That, more than anything, told me where things stood. When fathers use first names in front of staff, the family part has ended for the day. Ray said. Brent didn't have an answer. Of course he didn't. Because distributed horizontally is a phrase you say when you want responsibility to exist in a mist around you instead of landing on your desk where it belongs. By Friday morning, Redstone had a missed municipal shipment, a suspended $6.4 million customer release, an HR director gone, a legal complaint warming up, and a vice president of operations who had just embarrassed himself in front of supervisors and his own father. That was when Patrick Talbot called me personally. He did not waste time pretending this was casual. Dana. It's Patrick. I know. He said, I'd like to meet. I said, about the lawsuit or the plant? A pause. Then, both. I looked out at the backyard. What time? Noon. Corporate Conference Center. I said, Rebecca will join. Understood. The first meeting was not the meeting where I went back. It was the meeting where they learned I was not for sale at a discount. Patrick was there. Brent was there. Corporate counsel was there, and Rebecca sat beside me with a legal pad and the kind of stillness that makes people revise themselves before they speak. Patrick folded his hands. Dana, I want to say first that the way this was handled should not have happened. I said no. It shouldn't have. He nodded once. We'd like to resolve the legal matter and discuss bringing you back in an advisory capacity while we stabilize operations. Advisory. Yes. Brent jumped in too fast. Temporary. Strategic. More of a high-level continuity role. I looked at him. Brent, the plant is missing shipments because nobody knows who can approve a furnace vendor on a weekend. He opened his mouth. I kept going. That is not a high-level problem. The room went still. Patrick said, carefully, what would it take? I said, not this. Brent stared at me. What does that mean? It means I'm not coming back to explain my old job to the people who deleted it. He looked like he wanted to argue and had finally learned that arguing in front of counsel had a price. Good lesson. Expensive way to learn it. The breaking point came 4 days later. Farmark sent formal notice that if Redstone could not demonstrate a stable operating authority structure and recover scheduled performance within 10 business days, they would dual-source the program. Not terminate it entirely. Something worse. They would keep Redstone just enough alive to punish it. That meant permanent volume loss, reduced leverage, and a reputation hit that would travel faster than any press release. At the same time, Rebecca received Redstone's internal review packet for settlement discussions. It included enough dates, emails, and payroll reports to make intent look less like an argument and more like formatting. And on top of that, the state pension issue had now become part of a broader benefits compliance review, which meant corporate was no longer just worried about me winning. They were worried about me becoming the example. Patrick called again. This time his voice was flatter. Dana, we need you back in the building. I said, on what terms? We're prepared to discuss executive authority. I waited. Then he said, please. That word is rare from men like Patrick. Which is how you know it matters when it appears. The second meeting happened in Maple Room. Same vent above the door. Same hard, cold air on my hands. Same table. Different folder. This one was thicker. Patrick sat at the head. Brent was to his right. Rebecca beside me. Nobody rushed. Nobody smiled. The bottle of water on my side of the table was sweating onto the coaster again, and this time somebody had centered it. Small improvements. Patrick said, Dana, tell us what you want. So I did. I return as Vice President of Plant Operations and Continuity, effective immediately, reporting directly to you. Patrick nodded. I continued. My compensation is $312,000 annualized for a 6-month term, paid monthly. Full pension vesting preserved as though my service had been uninterrupted. Full back pay from September 11th forward. All attorney's fees paid by Redstone. A $340,000 settlement, separate from wages and benefits, payable on my retirement date. Brent shifted. Patrick did not. I went on. I have sole operational authority over plant staffing, emergency vendor approvals, maintenance escalation, shipment deviations, and customer recovery plans. No consultant. No committee. No executive override from operations without my written consent. Brent said, that's not workable. I looked at him. It worked for 19 years. He leaned forward. You're asking to come back and outrank the leadership structure. Rebecca said, very calmly, she is the leadership structure you removed. He sat back. I kept speaking. Ray Gutierrez is promoted to Director of Maintenance and Reliability. 15% raise. Written apology from the company for the position he was put in after my termination. Patrick made a note. Denise Holloway becomes Senior Manager of Payroll and Benefits Compliance. 15% raise. Written apology as well. She keeps her job, her file stays clean, and nobody retaliates against her for producing accurate records when asked. Patrick said, done. I said, and there will be a formal incident report. Not a talking points memo. A report. It documents the decision to eliminate my role, the review of my pension date, the approval chain failures, the missed customer commitments, and who made each decision. Brent turned to Patrick. Absolutely not. Patrick said nothing. Brent looked back at me. You cannot seriously expect us to put individual names into a permanent report like that. I said, you already did. I'm asking you to stop pretending they aren't there. His face changed. Not red. Not dramatic. Just stripped. He said, this is punitive. I shook my head once. It's operational. If you want the company to learn, it has to be allowed to remember. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Brent did something I had not seen him do once since he arrived. He lost the smooth part. He said, Dana, for God's sake, we cannot keep bleeding customers and money while you make this symbolic. Rebecca didn't move. I did. I leaned forward half an inch. This stopped being symbolic when you fired me 23 days before vesting and then blamed me for the weekend you created. Silence. Then I sat back. Those are the terms. Patrick looked at Brent. Then he looked at Rebecca. Then he looked at me. And he said, you'll have signed documents by 5. I stood. Not triumphantly. Just done. If they're signed by 5, I said, I'll be in the plant at 6 tomorrow morning. The documents arrived at 4:37. Rebecca read every line. Twice. At 5:12, she called and said, you're clear. I set my alarm for 4:45. Walking back into Redstone the next morning was quieter than people imagine those moments are. No applause. No dramatic music. Plants do not work that way. The parking lot looked the same. The air smelled like coolant and steel dust. The front lobby still had the same safety board with a dry erase marker that always ran out when you needed it. But people's faces were different. Keisha at the front desk saw me first and said, Dana. Just that. Then she smiled in the relieved way people smile when they've been holding their breath longer than they realized. Ray was halfway down the production corridor when he spotted me. He stopped, then kept walking faster until he was right in front of me. He said, you actually did it. I said, no. They did it. I just read carefully. He laughed. A real one. Then Denise came around the corner with a folder in her arms and said, "Please tell me those are signed." I held up the copy. "They're signed." She put a hand over her chest. "Good. Because payroll's been waiting to fix 3 different stupid things since Tuesday." I said, "Then let's stop waiting." That was the shift. Not loud. Just immediate. People stood straighter. Questions started moving toward answers instead of sideways into confusion. By 6:40 that morning, I had restored the emergency vendor approval chain, signed the furnace transfer, cleared the municipal recovery schedule, and put Farmark on a call for 8 o'clock. I took that call from my old office. Patrick joined. Brent did not. Farmark asked if the authority structure was stable. I said yes. They asked who held final operational approval. I said I do. They asked whether that would change again in the middle of a schedule recovery. I said no. That was enough. Not forgiveness. Not trust restored in one phone call. Enough. 8 months later, I was exactly where I had planned to be before Maple Room ever happened. Retired. On my own timeline. Not theirs. I spent 6 months as Vice President of Plant Operations and Continuity. In that time, Redstone recovered the Farmark volume, restored on-time delivery to 99.1%, cut premium freight by 63%, and reduced unplanned downtime below even our pre-Brent average. Ray thrived as Director of Maintenance and Reliability, which surprised no one who had ever met Ray. He finally had the authority that had been hiding inside the job all along, and he used it the way competent people do, without speeches. He rebuilt the weekend escalation map, standardized critical spares inventory, and ended the annual ritual of executives acting shocked that equipment needs maintenance. Denise flourished too. Senior Manager of Payroll and Benefits Compliance suited her beautifully. She rewrote Redstone's pension review process so that any separation involving retirement eligibility, vesting windows, or long service benefits required legal sign-off before HR could print a single page. Not discuss. Not draft. Not socialize. Print. I approved that policy myself. I also implemented 2 others. The first was the Continuity Authority Matrix, which named exactly who could approve what during equipment failures, shipment risks, or customer recovery events. No more, distributed horizontally. If a furnace died on a Saturday, the answer lived in one place, in plain English, with backups. The second was the Service Protection Review, which required corporate HR, payroll, and legal to jointly review any employment action affecting long-tenured employees with pension or benefit thresholds approaching. It was not complicated. Complicated had never been the problem. Brent Talbot was still at Redstone. Technically. His title became Vice President of Operational Planning, which meant he attended meetings, contributed ideas on slides, and had no authority over plant staffing, customer recovery, benefit-sensitive employment actions, or anything involving an actual consequence. He was not destroyed. He was contained, which, in a company, is much more useful. The formal incident report was completed and filed exactly as promised. It documented the pension date review, Melissa's cost containment email, the elimination of my role without transition planning, the missed shipments, the client escalation, the governance failures. It also documented the corrective actions. That part mattered to me. I had no interest in leaving behind a cautionary tale with no repair manual attached. Melissa Crane did not come back. Redstone's total cost from Brent's decision, the settlement, back pay, legal fees, expedited freight, customer penalties, lost discounts, outside review costs, and recovery expenses came to $4.83 million. That was the price of not reading the date on page 6. My retirement dinner with my husband happened in April. Same restaurant. Same salmon. Same chair across from me, this time occupied by a man who was enjoying himself instead of texting me photographs of absence. He raised his glass and said, "So, did Redstone pay for dessert this time?" I said, technically, yes. He laughed so hard he had to put the glass down. That may have been my favorite moment in the whole story. Not the settlement. Not Maple Room. Not the signed agreement at 4:37. That dinner. Because winning at work is satisfying. But having your life handed back to you in better condition than you left it, that's different. Sometimes I still think about that cold vent in Maple Room. The folder. The sweating bottle of water. Melissa sliding a pen toward me like the date on the paper was just a detail, like 23 days was nothing, like experience could be removed from a plant the way you remove a line item from a budget. It was never nothing. It was my whole leverage. Not anger. Not revenge. Not some dramatic secret. Just records. Timing. State law. And the patience to let arrogant people finish their own paperwork. If you've ever been underestimated at work, I hope this story reminds you that quiet preparation always beats loud arrogance. If this resonated, like and subscribe. I share stories like this every week. And remember, when they slide the folder across the table, read the date before you read the offer.